What would you do if you had exactly $94 left in your bank account, a foreclosure notice taped to your front door, and nothing, absolutely nothing, left to lose? That's the question Judith Calloway never thought she'd have to answer, until a Tuesday in October changed everything. Judith Calloway was 56 years old, and she had spent the last 31 of those years teaching 8th grade English at Pinecrest Middle School in Amarillo, Texas. She had loved that job in the stubborn, unglamorous way that people love difficult things. The smell of chalk dust and old paperbacks. The particular silence of a classroom when a room full of restless teenagers finally got swept up in a story. She had given that school everything she had. 2 years ago, Amarillo Unified cut her position as part of a budget restructuring that eliminated half the language arts department. They gave her a handshake, a plaque, and a $340 gift card to a steakhouse. After 3 decades of service. Her husband, Raymond, she always called him Ray. Everyone did, had died 14 months earlier. Congestive heart failure at 61. The kind of illness that doesn't kill you all at once but takes its time, draining everything you have in the process. By the time Ray passed, they had already refinanced the house twice. The life insurance policy they had paid into for 20 years barely covered his funeral and 3 months of the mortgage. Judith was not a woman who complained. That was something people said about her at Ray's service, over and over, as if it were a virtue. She was not so sure anymore. She had spent the last 14 months not complaining, and here she was. $94 in her checking account, a notice from Lone Star Bank taped to the front door of the house she had lived in since 1998, and a part-time job shelving books at the public library that paid $11.40 an hour and offered no benefits. She was exactly 6 weeks away from losing the house. It was her neighbor, a retired paralegal named Betty Okafor, who told her about the Potter County tax deed auction. Betty mentioned it offhandedly on a Thursday morning over the fence, the way people mention things they don't expect to go anywhere. They sell off properties that haven't paid taxes in years, Betty said. Sometimes you can pick up a lot of raw land for almost nothing, strip the copper, sell the scrap metal. A woman in Lubbock made $400 off a condemned laundromat. Judith had $94. $400 sounded like a lifeline. The auction was held on a Tuesday morning in a beige conference room inside the Potter County Courthouse, presided over by a tired-looking auctioneer named Glenn Stokes, who moved through the lots with the mechanical energy of a man running on convenience store coffee and habit. Most of the properties were worthless parcels on the outskirts of town, dry, scrubby plots seized for decades of back taxes that nobody wanted. The investors in the front rows let them pass without blinking. Judith had arrived intending to observe, to learn how it worked, maybe to bid on a small lot of commercial land if the price stayed low enough. She sat in the back, her hands folded over her purse, and watched Glenn Stokes work through his list. All right. Lot 218. Glenn shuffled his papers. Commercial parcel on County Road 71. Former Hargrove Textile Works. 8 acres, plus existing structure. 42,000 square feet, built 1961. County is opening the bid at $240 to cover the outstanding administrative fees. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the front rows. Judith didn't understand the joke until the man sitting directly in front of her, a heavy-set contractor type in a Carhartt jacket, leaned over to his partner and muttered, "The Hargrove Mill. That place has been condemned since Clinton was in office." She understood then. The Hargrove Textile Works was locally infamous in the way that derelict buildings become infamous in small cities, a crumbling brick monster out on County Road 71 that teenagers dared each other to enter, that the city had tried and failed to demolish 3 times due to asbestos abatement costs. Whoever bought it was buying a cleanup bill, not a building. "Do I have a bid of $240? Glenn asked, scanning the room with the look of a man who already knew the answer. Nothing. $240, folks. The copper pipe in the boiler room alone is probably worth more than that. Nothing. Judith looked down at her purse. She thought about the foreclosure notice on her front door. She thought about Ray, who had been the kind of man who believed in what he called getting unstuck, who used to say, when something wasn't working, that you had to pick up a different tool and try a different angle. She thought about Betty Okafor and the woman in Lubbock who made $400 off a condemned laundromat. She raised her hand. The room didn't go silent exactly. It shifted, the way a room shifts when something unexpected happens and nobody quite knows how to react. 240 in the back, Glenn said, and there was genuine surprise in his voice. To the lady in the grey coat. Anyone else? Any other bids? The man in the Carhartt jacket turned around. He looked at Judith the way people look at someone who has just done something they consider mildly self-destructive. Ma'am, that building's got black mold and asbestos and Lord knows what else. You understand that? I understand, Judith said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. Going twice. Glenn brought his gavel down. Sold lot 218 to the lady in the back for $240. She counted out 12 $20 bills at the clerk's desk, signed 4 pages of documents she read as quickly as she could, and walked out of the courthouse into the thin October sunlight. She sat in the parking lot in her 2009 Hyundai Sonata with the cracked passenger side mirror, and she did not cry. She was too tired to cry. She just sat there for a long time, staring at the receipt in her hands. She had $94 in her checking account. She had just spent $240 she didn't have, withdrawn that morning from her last small emergency savings account on a condemned textile mill. She had a crowbar in her trunk. She had a flashlight she'd bought at Dollar General. She had, as far as she could tell, absolutely nothing to lose. She turned the key and drove toward County Road 71. The Hargrove Textile Works sat back from the road behind a rusted chain-link fence that had been cut open so many times the gaps outnumbered the intact sections. The building was enormous up close. 4 stories of dark brown brick with rows of shattered windows that gaped like missing teeth. Graffiti covered the lower sections of the exterior wall in thick, colorful layers. Years of tags painted over tags. The loading dock on the south side had partially collapsed, its concrete floor buckling upward in a slow-motion heave. Judith parked beside the fence, pulled on a dust mask she'd bought at the same Dollar General, and shouldered her bag. Inside, flashlight, crowbar, a pair of heavy work gloves, a bottle of water, and the small brass compass that had belonged to Ray. He'd carried it through 2 years in the army and 33 years of marriage. She kept it in her jacket pocket now, the way some people carry a photograph. She pushed through a gap in the fence and approached the loading dock. The interior was immense and dark. The main floor had been a weaving room once. She could tell by the regular rows of heavy iron anchor bolts still sunk into the concrete floor where the machines had stood, the machines themselves long since sold for parts or stolen. The ceiling was high and vaulted, reinforced with steel I-beams that had rusted to the color of dried blood. Afternoon light filtered in through the broken windows in slanted columns, illuminating dust that hadn't been disturbed in years. Judith moved methodically. She had looked up copper scrap prices on her phone before she left the house. The going rate was $3.40 a pound at the Amarillo Metal Recovery Yard on 34th Street. She needed pipe, wire, fittings. The heavier, the better. She worked her way toward the back of the building, toward the boiler room, where the pipes would be thickest. 2 hours later, she had a small, discouraging pile of stripped wire near the loading dock entrance and a back that ached in the particular way that comes from crouching in awkward positions. The previous scavengers had been thorough. The boiler room was gutted. The electrical conduit was stripped. Whatever low-hanging copper the building had possessed was long gone. She sat on an old wooden pallet and drank some of her water and tried not to do the math in her head. The wind outside had picked up while she was working. She could hear it moving through the upper windows, and when she checked her phone, she saw 2 things. It was nearly 7 o'clock, and the weather app showed a severe thunderstorm watch until midnight. The sky through the broken windows had turned the particular greenish yellow that meant business. Driving back to Amarillo on bald front tires in a West Texas thunderstorm was not a risk she was willing to take. She needed to find a dry room with an intact ceiling and wait it out. She explored deeper into the building, down a corridor of offices that ran along the north wall. Most were open, their doors long since removed, their interiors a wreckage of collapsed drop ceilings and water-damaged particle board. But at the far end of the corridor, she found a heavy steel fire door, still set in its frame. The lock was broken, but the door opened, and inside was a room that had been, at some point, the mill supervisor's office. It was in better condition than anything she'd seen in the building. The windows were intact, protected by interior steel shutters that someone had cranked shut years ago. There was a battered metal desk, a filing cabinet with its drawers hanging open and empty, and a set of built-in bookshelves along the south wall. Their contents stripped long ago, the shelves themselves warped and dusty. The room smelled of old paper and mildew, but it was dry, and when the thunder started rolling in from the west, she was grateful for that. She dragged the desk chair into a corner, sat down, and turned off her flashlight to save the battery. She didn't think she'd sleep, but exhaustion is its own kind of gravity, and somewhere between one thunderclap and the next, she was gone. She woke to a sound she couldn't immediately place, a low, rhythmic knocking, 3 beats, a pause, 3 beats again. Not the storm. The storm was still going, rain hammering the steel shutters, but this sound was underneath it. Mechanical, deliberate. Judith sat up, her hand closing around the flashlight. The room was completely dark except for the thin blue-gray seam of light under the door. She checked her phone, just past 2 a.m. Knock, knock. It was coming from the south wall, behind the bookshelves. She sat perfectly still for a long moment, the way you do when your brain is weighing mundane explanation against genuine alarm. Settling foundation, rats, pipes contracting in the cold, the storm. But it wasn't any of those things. She had spent enough time in old buildings to know what those sounds sounded like. This had structure. This was deliberate. She clicked on her flashlight and pointed it at the south wall. The bookshelves were 5-foot-tall units, each about 3 feet wide, bolted to the wall studs, or what she had assumed were wall studs. But now, in the direct beam of the flashlight, she noticed something she hadn't noticed before. The last unit on the right didn't share the same dust pattern as the others. Its top surface was dusty, but the floor directly in front of it was cleaner, a faint arc shape, as if the unit had been swung outward at some point in the not-too-distant past. Judith stood up slowly. She walked to the bookshelf and ran her hand along the right edge, where it met the wall. Her fingertips found a gap, thin, maybe a 1/4 inch, but continuous, running the full height of the unit. She looked at the mounting brackets on the back. They were decorative, not actually attached to the wall. She grabbed the right edge with both hands and pulled. The unit swung outward on a pivot point, smooth and nearly silent, counterweighted somewhere inside the wall. Behind it was a door, real and solid, steel frame, with a cipher lock that had been professionally installed and looked entirely out of place in a building that hadn't legally operated since 1994. The cipher lock was not engaged. The bolt was retracted, the door standing a centimeter ajar. Someone had already been inside, recently. The cold moved through her chest at that realization, slow and deliberate, nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She stood at that door for a full 30 seconds, flashlight fixed on the gap, listening. The knocking had stopped. The only sound was rain. She pushed the door open with her crowbar. The room beyond was small, maybe 12 by 14 feet, raw concrete walls, concrete floor, a single overhead light fixture that was, against all expectation, still wired. The switch was just inside the door. She flipped it. A fluorescent tube stuttered and caught. The room was a filing room, floor-to-ceiling industrial shelving on 3 walls, the kind with heavy steel rails and adjustable brackets, And on those shelves, arranged with a precision that stood in sharp contrast to the chaos of the building around it, were row after row of manila folders in cardboard banker's boxes, each box dated and labeled in faded black marker. The dates ran from 1971 to 1993. But that wasn't what stopped her breath. On the center shelf, at eye level, inside a Ziploc bag that had kept it clean through 30-some years of abandonment, was a brown leather binder. She could see the embossed logo on the cover, even through the plastic. Texas Department of Transportation, and beneath the binder, stacked neatly in a second bag, were what appeared to be survey maps, large, folded sheets of blueprint paper, covered in coordinates and boundary lines and property descriptions. Judith reached for the binder. She opened it on the shelf and began to read. It took her less than 5 minutes to understand that she was holding evidence of one of the largest private land fraud schemes in Texas history. The binder was an internal ledger, handwritten entries, each one detailing a transaction. On one side, parcels of state and federal land in the Texas Panhandle, identified by survey coordinates. On the other side, names, buyers who had purchased those parcels at prices far below assessed value, routed through a series of shell companies, and facilitating every transaction appearing on nearly every page, H. Hargrove. As in Hargrove Textile Works, as in the building she was standing in. Cornelius Hargrove had owned this mill. He had died in 1996, but the ledger suggested that for 2 decades before that, he had been running an entirely different kind of business out of this building, a bribery and land fraud operation that had stolen tens of thousands of acres from the state of Texas and private landowners alike, enriching a rotating cast of politicians, appraisers, and county clerks in the process. She pulled a second box off the shelf and found cancelled checks, originals, made out to names she recognized, a former Amarillo city councilman, a state representative who had served until 2004, a federal land management official, all written on accounts tied to companies that didn't officially exist. She had found a paper trail that could burn careers, maybe put people in prison, people who, if this ledger was accurate, were still alive. Judith set the binder down carefully on the shelf. She needed to call someone. She reached into her pocket for her phone and turned toward the door, and that's when she saw the light. A narrow beam, a flashlight, moving in the corridor outside the bookshelf door, moving toward her. She pressed back against the shelving and cut her own light. The fluorescent overhead was still on. Nothing she could do about that without crossing directly into the doorway. She looked around the room. No other exits. The shelves were too thin to hide behind. She had a crowbar and a compass and nothing else. The bookshelf unit swung open. The man who stepped into the room was in his mid-60s, fit in the way of someone who has money, and uses it to stay that way, with close-cropped silver hair and the composed, unhurried expression of someone very accustomed to being the most powerful person in any given room. He wore canvas work pants and a dark jacket, and in his right hand, held loosely at his side, was a compact revolver. She knew him. Not personally, but by face. Drew Hargrove, Cornelius Hargrove's son, currently the owner of Hargrove Development Group, one of the larger commercial real estate companies in the Panhandle. His face had been on a billboard on Coulter Avenue for the better part of a decade. "Mrs. Calloway," Drew said. His voice was perfectly level. He glanced at the open binder on the shelf behind her. "You are faster than I expected." "You knew I'd come here," Judith said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "I've been watching this auction for 3 years." He stepped further into the room, placing himself between her and the only exit. "My father's estate couldn't buy it back directly. There are conflict of interest provisions when the original delinquency involves the prior owner's estate, so I needed an intermediary, someone who would buy it without asking too many questions, come out here for the copper, and leave before they found anything important." He glanced at the binder again. "You were supposed to find nothing. You were very thorough." "What is all of this?" "My father's insurance policy. Drew moved to the center shelf, keeping the revolver at his side, and looked at the ledger the way a man looks at something that has cost him a great deal of sleep. He collected people, my father. He was very good at it. You pay someone once, you own a piece of them. He kept records because records are leverage. When the Fed started looking at him in '93, he sealed this room and moved out of state. He meant to come back for it when things cooled down. He had a stroke in Scottsdale before he got the chance. And you've been trying to get in here ever since. The cipher combination was in his personal papers. I had that for years. He reached out and touched the edge of the door. What I didn't have was the panel release for the bookshelf. He never wrote that down. I've been inside this building 11 times over the past 4 years. In this office many times. I walked past that bookshelf every single time. He looked at her, and there was something in his face that was not quite respect and not quite contempt. Something more pragmatic than either. You found it in 40 minutes. What do you want, Drew? My father's records, he said simply. These ledgers are 30 years old. Most of the people named in them are dead. The ones who aren't are old men who've spent those 30 years building enough institutional protection that a stack of handwritten checks won't touch them. But they don't know that, and they will pay handsomely to make sure no one ever finds out. These records are worth several $1 million to the right people, Mrs. Calloway, and the only thing standing between me and that money right now is you. He raised the revolver. Judith did not look at the gun. She had read enough about moments like this. She was an English teacher. She had read everything to know that looking at the gun was a mistake. The gun was a fact she could not change. She looked, instead, at Drew's face. He was a man who had spent 4 years planning this, careful, deliberate, not prone to panic. But also, she realized, a man who had never had to point a gun at a 56-year-old schoolteacher in a concrete room before, and the slight tension in his jaw told her he was working harder than he wanted to appear. The ledger names living people, Judith said. Her hands were at her sides. She kept her voice flat. If this goes public, how many of those people spend the rest of their lives knowing it could happen at any moment? That's the point. No, I mean, how many of them are already watching? She held his gaze. You said yourself been inside this building 11 times. Did you come alone every time, Drew? Or did you have help? And if you had help, did that help know what you were looking for? The first flicker, barely perceptible. But she had spent 30 years reading teenagers, and she knew what it looked like when someone's certainty shifted beneath them. She kept going. Because if even one of the people in these ledgers has been watching this property, and they'd have every reason to, if they knew Cornelius kept records, then someone already knows you're here tonight. And if I disappear, and this evidence disappears, the first person anyone looks at is the man who had the most to gain from both. She wasn't certain any of this was true. She was building an argument the way she had always built arguments, from logic and pressure and the willingness to hold the line. But it landed. Drew's grip tightened on the revolver. You're bluffing. I'm a retired teacher who owns a condemned building and has $94 in her bank account, Judith said. I have nothing to bluff with. I'm just telling you what your situation looks like from the outside. A long silence, rain against the steel shutters, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead. You want to make a deal, Drew said. Not a question. I want to walk out of this building, Judith said. That's all. I want to get in my car and I'll drive home and never come back here. You can have everything in this room. I won't say a word to anyone. Drew studied her. He was calculating, weighing 2 bad options the way careful men do. The deed transfers to you, he said slowly. You own the property now. If I want clear access to this room without complications, I need your cooperation on the title, a quitclaim deed. Fine. I'll need 48 hours to move everything. That's fine too. If you talk to anyone, before those 48 hours are up. I understand, Judith said. She watched his gun hand drop to his side. She reached into her jacket pocket, her fingers closing around the brass compass. Cold and solid and familiar, she held it there for a moment, not as a weapon, not as a plan, but because it was Ray's, and this was the kind of moment where you needed something real in your hand. Then she slid her left hand quietly along the shelf behind her, closed her fingers around the leather binder, and pulled the cord on the overhead fluorescent light. The room went black. She moved immediately, low and to the left, toward the door. She had noted where it was, exactly, relative to where she was standing, the way you learn to note exits when you've spent 30 years managing classrooms full of 8th graders who occasionally needed to be headed off at the door. She heard Drew swear sharply, heard his footsteps pivot toward where he thought she was, heard the shelving rattle as he grabbed for something to orient himself. She made the doorway. She was through the bookshelf unit, and into the office, and into the corridor before she heard the light come back on behind her. She ran, not fast, not gracefully, her left knee protesting the way it had protested every flight of stairs since 2019. But she ran, down the corridor onto the main floor, across this open space toward the loading dock, the binder tucked under her arm, her flashlight off, navigating by the dim grey light coming through the broken upper windows. Behind her she heard the steel fire door bang open. She hit the loading dock, dropped down the side instead of taking the collapsed ramp, landed wrong on her right ankle and felt it roll, kept going anyway. The chain-link fence, the gap, her car, the key. Her hands were shaking hard enough that she missed the ignition twice. The engine caught on the third try. She drove for exactly 1.3 miles with her headlights off until the mill was behind a rise and she could no longer see it. Then she pulled onto the shoulder, turned on the lights, and called 911. She gave the dispatcher her name and location. Then she said 4 words she had a feeling would escalate things appropriately. "I have the ledgers." She was right. By 4:30 in the morning, County Road 71 was lit up with cruisers and federal vehicles. The Potter County Sheriff's Department and 2 agents from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit stood in the supervisor's office while a third photographed every document on every shelf. Drew Hargrove had not run. He had been standing in the parking lot of the mill when the first units arrived, which the lead agent, a compact woman named Special Agent Renee Vasquez, later told Judith suggested either remarkable composure or a total failure of imagination. Judith sat in the back of an ambulance and let a paramedic wrap her ankle. It was not broken. It felt broken, but it was not broken. Vasquez came to find her when the sun was just starting to show over the flat eastern horizon. "Mrs. Calloway, the documents appear to be exactly what you described. This is going to take months to untangle. But what you found in there, we've had leads pointing to this for years. We just couldn't find the physical records." She paused. "How did you know where the room was?" "I didn't," Judith said. "I was just looking for copper pipe." Vasquez almost smiled. "There's a representative from the Texas General Land Office on his way down from Amarillo. The land fraud documented in those ledgers affects hundreds of parcels, some of which are currently under litigation. I can't make you any promises, but the recovery value on those land titles is in the tens of millions of dollars. There are whistleblower provisions under state law." Judith looked at her wrapped ankle, then at the compass in her palm, which she'd been turning over and over in her fingers since she sat down. "I just need my house," she said. That was in October. By February, the Potter County District Attorney had filed 12 counts of fraud against Drew Hargrove, and the Texas Attorney General's office had opened a formal investigation into the land transactions documented in the ledgers. The recovery litigation was, as Vasquez had predicted, enormously complex. But the whistleblower statutes were clear, and the state's representation was persuasive. Judith's attorney, a woman recommended by Betty Okafor, who turned out to have an opinion on everything useful, negotiated a finder's fee and whistleblower award that the court finalized in late January. The morning the wire transfer cleared, Judith sat at her kitchen table in the house on Ridgemont Drive with a cup of coffee and looked at the foreclosure notice she had kept taped to the refrigerator all these months. She wasn't entirely sure why she'd kept it there. Maybe as a reminder of how close it had gotten. Maybe because taking it down felt like the kind of thing you should do deliberately, not in passing. She took it down now, folded it in half, and put it in the drawer with the old electric bills, where it could stop being a monument and go back to being a piece of paper. Then she took the compass out of her pocket and set it on the table in front of her. The needle swung and settled, pointing north, the way it always did. Ray used to say, when you're lost, you don't need to see the whole road. You just need to know which direction you're facing. Judith wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Outside, the February sun was doing its best over the Texas Panhandle, pale and determined and not yet warm, but there, trying. She sat with that for a while. Then she got up, found her coat, and went out to see what was next. If Judith's story hit you somewhere real, the moment she chose to fight instead of fold, the compass that refused to be just a compass, share it with someone who needs to hear that when everything is stripped away, sometimes the only move left is the right one. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe to Keep the Drama. We'll be here every week with another one. Drop a comment. What would you have done in that concrete room?